If there ever is a settlement on Mars, I'm sure that one of the first things they'll open up is a coffee house.
It's one of the most complex beverages on Earth.
$2 for a cup of coffee. 1 cent goes to the coffee grower.
It's mountain grown.
Coffee is the second most valuable legal traded commodity on the face of the earth, after oil.
E preto pela cor do negro que deu toda essa riqueza para o seu patrão, né?
It's just this little seed and has this enormous political, social, and economic impact on human beings.
This is the epic story of a beverage that shares its birthplace with our earliest human ancestors. In this hour, we see how coffee spreads from the ancient world, becoming the dark medium through which social, sexual, economic, and political life evolves, fostering much of what is best and worst about our civilization. From the hills of Ethiopia to the marinas of Seattle, people around the globe drink 500 billion cups of coffee a year, half of them at breakfast. Every morning, everywhere, people prepare their favorite cup in their favorite way. For sheer pleasure, few morning rituals rival a good cup of coffee.
Coffee has been at the center of conversation for hundreds of years.
Triple grande 2% latte?
It's a social, romantic beverage. It's a theatrical experience.
The experience of coffee alters cultures and lives every place it goes. Romances are sparked, revolutions conspired, all over this dark, potent brew.
It is black and it is clearing our brain. So it produces light in our brain. Then it is something that went through fire and it has a certain hellish connotation. So there is some black magic associated with coffee.
As the essential morning beverage, coffee delivers the largest dose of the world's most widely taken legal drug.
If tomorrow coffee were suddenly withdrawn from the world and there were no such thing as coffee anymore, people would go frantic, for one thing. I mean, they would begin to go like this.
From the bean to the cup, coffee provides a livelihood of sorts for over 25 million people. 100 million more depend on coffee for their survival. The story of coffee begins with a green bean, hidden in the red cherry of the coffee tree. Some call it magical, others say it's evil. But no matter how jealously or greedily guarded, neither kings, nor merchants, nor priests could keep it from spreading around the earth. For sooner or later, everyone is seduced by the irresistible bean. This is a saga which begins over 1,000 years ago, deep in the ancient forest of a land often called the cradle of humanity.
No one really knows who discovered coffee or when exactly it was, but we do know that it was in Ethiopia, that coffee still grows wild in the mountains of Ethiopia. And there's a wonderful legend of Kaldi, the goat herd, that makes as much sense as any other creation myth.
Isarraa kan ka'e nyaata sanirraa ka'e maaliif bunni kun maalirraa nama si'eessaa jechuurraa baramee kanaan bu'an jedhantu immoo buqqisee sibiidhaan dhaabbadhaa wanni kun waan gaariidha waan fuulduratti barbaadamu jedhee han biyya dhaabsise isaanii han jedhu taarikii nan dhagaye. Ijoollee re'ee tiksutu argee erga san immoo abbaa Jabir Baalbuu kan jedhamtu takka taattalee immoo biyya hundaafus akka faafalee kan jedhe isaanii taarikii kan isaanii kanaan dabarsinaa. Bunni immoo har'a buna coocee kana fakkaatu hin jiru. Akka kana immoo hin arga ijoollee re'ee tiksitu jedhanii. Gin zaman sana immoo namni fuudhee biyya akka faafalee biyya keenya qaqqabee abbaa Jabir Baalbuu kan jedhan isaanii santu biyya qaqqabee biyya hunda akka faafalee. Har'as immoo wanni buna coocee kana fakkaatu hin jiru caalaa bunaati nabbaariidha. Bunni immoo biyya kana akka baabii kana jiru akkana amma bunni kun akka kana argamee. Bunni immoo har'a buna coocee kana fakkaatu hin jiru bakka biraatiin argamu.
He suddenly felt all kinds of energy and excitement, and he started dancing around and singing, and he felt like writing poetry to his girlfriend and things like that. So that's how coffee was supposedly discovered.
Ethiopians are the first to gather coffee growing wild in the forest. It is likely, as in the Kaldi legend, that the coffee cherries are simply chewed at first, or the beans ground with fat to make an energy bar. Later, the Ethiopians brew the leaves with boiled water as a weak tea. It isn't until the 1400s that someone, perhaps accidentally, roasts the beans and discovers how good they smell. They grind them and brew a black, potent beverage. Ah, coffee.
Every Ethiopian knows coffee's birthplace is in Ethiopia. You know, Ethiopians are proud of the coffee. You know, from the not only coffee growing areas, all Ethiopians, they drink early morning coffee as a prestige. If you go to any Ethiopian house, they prepare coffee before any dish. Coffee will be family beverage. It brings friendship, kinship. The coffee is an heritage and a proud of Ethiopia's culture.
Haji Muhammad's granddaughter prepares an elaborate coffee ceremony that is centuries old. Only the women of the house can roast the beans. When they begin to crackle, she ladles them on a metal plate to be blessed by the spirits of fertility and prosperity. The ceremony commemorates the journey of 3 sheiks who went into the wilderness in search of God. When they were nearly starving, it is said, God appeared and instructed them to grind coffee beans for food. There are always 3 servings of coffee to honor the 3 sheiks. The first round is called Abel, then Tona, and finally Baraka, which means the blessing. The mistress pours the boiled coffee from high up to let the aroma permeate the room. She adds a little sugar, or sometimes salt. The brew is thick and strong, with some of the grounds still floating in the cup. The eldest is always served first. While the ancient Ethiopians revere their wild coffee, they cannot keep it to themselves. It is only a matter of time until traders bring beans to the Arabian port of Mocha. From there, the Arabs begin the first known cultivation of coffee in the nearby mountains of Yemen.
The name coffee probably comes not from Ethiopia, but from Yemen. Coffee cultivation went across the Red Sea, and so the Arabs began to grow it in Yemen. And the Arab word for wine is kawa, and that's the derivation. They thought it was kind of like a substitute for wine. It was legal, whereas wine wasn't. And so I think that coffee probably comes from the word kawa.
Some people say that coffee was named for a little town in Ethiopia called Kafta. Other people say that Kafta was named for coffee. Some people say that it came from coffee's power to forestall sleep, and that it was an old word for something that puts off your desire for something. The truth is that nobody knows where the word coffee came from.
Forestalling their desire for sleep, the Sufis are better able to perform their ecstatic devotions. The invigorating potion enhances their swirling trances as they reach out to merge with the divine. Soon, the black brew spreads from temple to temple as a holy ceremonial drink.
It was through the Sufis that coffee made its way through Arab society. See, the Sufis were of the laity. They came from all walks of life, and they used to meet at night to say their prayers. Then they'd go back home and they'd go to their jobs and so on. Well, they brought the knowledge of coffee back with them.
Very quickly, it went over into secular life. Very wealthy people would have entire rooms devoted to coffee drinking, and became the social thing that you did when somebody came over. For poorer people, coffee khanas, coffee houses, sprang up, and people began to frequent them. They became huge social venues. People began to play games there, prostitutes began to hang out there.
As coffee houses become the gathering places of the poor, coffee also gains a reputation as a troublemaking social brew.
You know, there weren't many places where strangers could meet and talk and have conversations, people of all levels of society and so on. There weren't any places like that. And the coffee houses was something that no one had ever seen before. And they were considered to be a source of vice, a source of possible sedition and revolution, and with good reason, actually. Because the truth is, people do talk about politics at coffee houses.
In 1511, the governor of Mecca, whose name was Khair Beg, heard that people were doing lewd and terrible things in the coffee houses, but worse than that, they were saying bad and funny things about him. They were making up satirical verses about him. So he decided that he would ban the coffee houses.
People come there, they carry on, they mix with other people, they get involved in treason. But the worst thing is, they're drinking coffee. And coffee is a drug, it's an intoxicant. Well, the Quran prohibits the use of intoxicants. This is a very serious matter in the Muslim religion. In fact, the penalty for using intoxicants is execution. And he tried to ban the coffee houses. However, the Sultan of Cairo, who was his boss, who loved coffee and it was being served in Cairo. When he heard about this, he reversed the order.
Disputes among the ruling classes about the disreputable coffee houses only adds to the popularity of the irresistible bean. As the Turks conquer the Arab world, they inherit coffee and coffee culture. Soon, coffee secures a place for itself in the everyday lives of ordinary people. And although coffee is still enjoyed in many domestic rituals, Turkish men come to prefer the public coffee houses.
Evimizde bir kahve kültürü var, kahve içme kültürü var. Sonra erkekler arasında toplanma yeri açısından bir kahve. İlk başlarda böyle namaz aralarında bir soluklanmak, bir vakit geçirmek amaçlı, sohbet etmek amaçlı. Oraya genelde Türk entelektüelleri, yazarlar, şairler, edebiyatçılar gidiyorlar. Orada sohbet ediyorlar. Çeşitli tartışmalar yapılıyor. Hatta bugün ankormanların televizyonlarda bildiğiniz üzere günlük gazeteler okurlar ve yorumlar yaparlar. İşte o zamanlar insanların tartıştığı, bilgi alışveriş içinde bulundukları bir yer olarak biliniyor. Kahve ve kahvehane özellikle insanların sohbet edip tartışmaları için, bir araya gelmeleri için çok önemli bir yer. Kahve de bunun için çok önemli bir araç. Ayrı bir atasözümüz vardır. Gönül ne kahve ister ne kahvehane, gönül dostu ister, kahve bahane.
Coffee has always been important for both the men and women in Turkey. But with the strict separation of the sexes, women have long been forbidden in the coffee houses. The women of the Sultan's harem drink coffee in an atmosphere of languorous sensuality. Afterwards, they have their coffee grounds read by the court fortune teller, who tells them if they are satisfying the Sultan and whom he loves the best. Even today, a young woman can still have her future divined in the grounds of her cup.
Kahve bizim kültürümüzde önemli bir yeri vardır, kahve falı ve kahvenin. Örneğin bir genç kız evlenmeyi düşündüğü, evlilik çağındaki bir genç kız öncelikle görücü olarak gelen kişilere, kendisini görmeye gelen kişiler için niyetini belirten bir ifadeyle kahvenin içine tuz ya da şeker, eğer istiyorsa şeker, istemiyorsa tuz koyarak sunar ve karşısındaki insan da yine aynı şekilde eğer gerçekten ve karşıdaki insanın tepkisini de özellikle gözlemlerler. Eğer karşısındaki insan istiyorsa bu kişiyle evliliğe inzivacı diyeyim, kahveyi her ne olursa olsun kahvedeki içinde tuz ya da şeker içer. Terazi burcu toprak mı olur? Terazi hava, topraksınız ama.
As the taste for coffee grows, the Turks become more vigilant about protecting their beloved bean.
It was a very jealously guarded commodity, particularly after the Ottoman Turks took over. They spread coffee far and wide throughout the Ottoman Empire. So this was obviously something that they didn't want anybody to be able to grow besides them. So they were very careful to keep the monopoly. Before they exported any coffee beans, they would parboil them to make sure that they weren't fertile, that they couldn't be grown. So it became this precious commodity that people tried to smuggle out. Eventually, an Indian named Baba Budan, this is probably true, he taped some seeds around his stomach underneath his clothing and smuggled them out and began to grow some in India. Then the Dutch got hold of some fertile seeds and began growing them in their greenhouses in Amsterdam.
From Holland, the Dutch transport the precious coffee plant to their colony in Java. There, they enslave the natives and force them to cultivate coffee. By 1683, mocha and Java are the most sought-after beans, and coffee is poised to conquer Europe along with the armies of the Sultan.
It was during a siege of Vienna by an Arab sultan who had sent a tremendous army to conquer the West. And he made his way to the gates of Vienna, and he surrounded Vienna. He was about to conquer the city.
All of Europe was in the balance. They were trying to figure out who they could send to try to get some sort of reinforcements. There was a Pole named Franz George Kolschitsky who had lived in Arab lands and who spoke the language. So he dressed up as an Arab. He snuck out through the lines,
delivered a message to the French troops that they needed help. The French came, they defeated the Arabs, and the Arabs fled. In their haste, they left behind their bags of unroasted coffee.
Nobody knew what they were. They thought they were camel fodder, so they were burning them. Kolschitsky smelled it, and he said, "Oh, that's coffee. Don't burn that. I'll take it if nobody else wants it."
Having lived among the Turks, Kolschitsky knows the rudiments of roasting and brewing coffee. He soon opens the Blue Bottle, Vienna's first coffee house. Like the Turks, he adds sugar to sweeten the cup.
People in Vienna didn't like the grounds in the bottom, so they started to filter it. And they didn't like the raw taste of just plain coffee, so they started adding milk to it. And it's the way that we have it today.
Cheese.
Chin chin.
While the Viennese introduced the modern way of drinking coffee, the perfection of coffee culture takes place in Italy. But wherever it appears, there is also resistance to the exotic new beverage.
For some reason, coffee arrived in Europe with negative connotations about it. It was almost as if there was an advance warning coming. Something bad is coming, which everybody's going to like. The Turkish men went to coffee houses where they drank coffee without women. They also went to bathhouses without women, and some of the Turkish regiments had homosexuals in them. And consequently, the connection of coffee as the Turks drink meant that there was an association that coffee made you effeminate. And that was an attitude that was brought over to Venice. So there was a whole lot of ideas which stuck in people's minds because largely the whole Muslim world was closed off to the West.
Italian priests regard the Turkish foreigners and their black brew as a threat to Christianity. They petition Clement VIII to ban the evil Muslim practice of drinking coffee. But when the Pope tastes it, he reputedly finds the drink so delicious, he decides to baptize it instead. Soon, more and more contact is being made as the Turks begin to trade with Venice.
Tramite questi mercanteggi Venezia offriva qualcosa e la Turchia logicamente contraccambiava con il caffè. È stata presa con un po' di scetticismo all'inizio dai veneziani e poi dopo l'apertura del Florian nel 1720, che è stato praticamente il primo caffè che è stato aperto qui a Venezia, un po' alla volta i veneziani sono abituati a questo caffè. I 30 anni successivi credo siano stati aperti più di 200 caffè qui a Venezia. C'era dei caffè per le persone borghesi, diciamo, e anche per i ricchi, insomma. Il Florian era uno di questi, per gente ricca, ecco.
Venetians may be taking a liking to coffee, but they're keeping their distance from Turks and other outsiders.
The Caffè Lavena in St. Mark's Square was well known in the 18th century because at that age Venetians didn't want to meet foreigners. So the Lavena was the foreigners' coffee shop, and the Venetians didn't come here because they come in the opposite side to the Florian. So it was a meeting point, the Lavena, for all the tourists of that age. Caffè Lavena is well known as the Richard Wagner's Cafe because he used to stay here every afternoon at 5 o'clock with his wife and his children, speaking to the owner of this coffee shop. That was Carlo Lavena, my great-grandfather. Here he was in the upper gallery writing the finest pages of Tristano und Isolde, or the second act of the Parsifal. And he stayed here also with other musicians, and they made a sort of circle of musicians in this coffee shop.
The German Richard Wagner composes at the Lavena, while the Italian Giuseppe Verdi composes at the Florian. Neither would think of crossing the piazza to meet the other. As Wagner and Verdi battle musically, others are dreaming of love, and coffee is their elixir. Since the Florian and the Lavena are frequented by women, the notorious Casanova spends hours in both cafes. As one of the few Venetians seeking romance on either side of the square, he is commemorated with a seductive coffee named just for him.
We are going to have our Casanova coffee. This is the secret recipe with the spices. And this is the espresso. We are going to mix them. And to put on the top the whipped cream. We call Casanova coffee because the recipe is really ancient, and we took these spices from the 18th century. So if you go and test this kind of coffee, the mix is really incredible.
Italians love their coffee and have greatly enriched the world's coffee culture. At Ili Cafe in Trieste, baristas learn the art of presenting the most delightful cup. Their masterpiece is the magisterial cappuccino, named for the resemblance to the color and peak on the Capuchin monk's cloak, and usually drunk, at least by the Italians, in the morning. Ernesto Ili, the grand old man of Italian coffee, knows how far the cup has come from its ancient methods of preparation. Other Europeans have developed many different systems to make their coffee, but for impatient Italians, they all take too long.
The Napolitan people are impatient. And one guy had a friend in Milano and said, listen, can you make it a little faster? I have to wait 6-8 minutes to have my cup of coffee. Put some pressure on top. And the guy put some pressure. And this was the beginning of the espresso. The espresso that is so strong in taste, in aroma, and in the body is weak in caffeine because you do not have time to extract all the caffeine that is in the ground coffee. The art of the espresso is to stop extracting when all the good stuff is in the cup and all the bad remains to be thrown away. And this means approximately 1.5 ounces. So this is why espresso must be prepared in a small cup, because the temptation to put some more water in a big cup will spoil the pleasure of a perfectly prepared espresso. So you have this funny contradiction. It is strong, smells a lot, and it has a low caffeine. This is why the Italian can drink 10 cups of coffee, espresso, in Italy. And when they visit the States and they drink 10 cups of American coffee, they get shaky because it's too much caffeine. When you want to be stimulated, you want to have your sympathetic system bright and powerful, you take an amphetamine, but no relaxation. If you want to be relaxed, you have a glass of wine, but no alertness. Only coffee produces alertness and relaxation, and this is what makes coffee so magic. I understand that people were feeling coffee to be magic, because it is really magic.
The cafe has always been home to artists and intellectuals. A place to give expression to caffeine-inspired eruptions of imagination and ideas. The French novelist Balzac wrote in a cafe while drinking his usual 40 cups a day. Sparks shoot all the way to the brain, he said about coffee, and the cavalry of metaphor deploys with a magnificent gallop.
So here we are in the middle of the Golden Triangle, with the Café de Flore on my left. Café de Flore, famous for writers and film stars. And here we have Le Deux Magots, another literary cafe. Usually the same kind of thing, writers, philosophers. Behind me, you have Brasserie Lippe, which is specialized in politicians, chiefs of state, and film stars.
The French, who are now very famous for coffee, were somewhat late, but still in the late 1600s, the Turkish Sultan, who was the ambassador to Paris, set this craze going for all things Arab. So all the French people would dress up with little head things, and they would lie around on their pillows, and they would drink coffee. And so coffee took Paris by storm.
The French are enamored with coffee, but they don't know how to make it. Procopio del Cortel, an Italian, seizes on this opportunity. In 1686, he opens Café Le Procope, thus introducing the French to the French café.
Évidemment, les premières à répandre la mode, ce sont les femmes, qui venaient tout simplement parce qu'elles pouvaient prendre indifféremment du thé, du café, du chocolat et des pâtisseries. Et notamment, ce que l'on avait apporté, là encore de Turquie, les premiers croissants. Pourquoi croissants? Parce que comme le croissant des Turcs battus à Vienne. D'autre part, le café est réputé aphrodisiaque pour les hommes. Et donc, ici, et là non plus c'est pas vrai, mais c'est pas grave. Le café, c'est une boisson de femme, et donc, c'est assez logique, le café va être défendu par les femmes contre le vin, qui lui est réputé assoupir les performances masculines. Il venait aussi bien des femmes chic, de la haute société, de l'aristocratie, que des gens qui venaient voir ce qui se passait, l'endroit à la mode. Et évidemment des hommes, puisqu'il y avait des jolies femmes. Donc va se créer une société qu'on appellera la société des cafés. Et pourquoi est-ce qu'il devient français? Parce que, comme je vous l'ai dit, à Paris, mais en France en général, à cette époque-là, on se parle très naturellement. C'est la conversation qui fait le succès du café.
C'est toujours simple, la démocratie, c'est sûr.
Il n'y a pas de barrière de classe dans la conversation.
Bien sûr.
Il n'y a pas de barrière de sexe, il n'y a pas de barrière de race, d'accent. Ça, c'est totalement original.
Que nous allions, que la société va vers la sagesse.
From the earliest days of Le Procope, the French have been gathering in cafes to engage one another in discussion and debate.
Besoin d'un espace vital où ils font. Parce que plus on a d'espace vital, plus on consomme et plus on fait de la merde. Et c'est peut-être comme ça que les problèmes se régleront.
On peut dire, par exemple,
Conversation can be raised to a fine art now that coffee is replacing wine and beer as the beverage of choice.
Tout le monde boit, les hommes, les femmes, dans la haute société, dans le bas peuple. On boit beaucoup. Et c'est pas en France on boit le plus. On boit plus en Allemagne, on boit le plus en Hollande, en Angleterre. En France, sous Louis XIV et Louis XV, donc 17e, 18e, un homme boit en moyenne 7 à 8 litres de vin par jour, plus à peu près un demi-litre d'alcool pur par jour. Et il travaille 14, 15 heures par jour. Tout le monde boit, j'insiste bien là-dessus, même les enfants.
I believe Europe was under an alcoholic haze for decades. Then all of a sudden coffee started to come in and you found a new place where people could drink and communicate and join together without the alcohol.
Newly sober and alert, Europeans can finally take stock. Around the marble-top tables of their cafes, the French discuss events of the day and consider what might be done about them. Once again, coffee is stimulating social ferment.
The coffee shop had an important role to play where the coffee shop owner put newspapers around. They became places where people would congregate to have important political discussions. And I've got no doubt that it certainly helped to have a clear head. No use if you're slightly beschwipst, slightly drunk, you know, that doesn't make for good discussions about, war plans or political plans.
very many revolutionary movements started in cafes. That's absolutely true. Because, for instance, Marat, Robespierre, Danton, they said, and all these people were beheaded afterwards, but until they had their head, they could talk and discuss and really do something.
C'est ce que fait Camille Desmoulins. Après la chute de la Bastille, il donne rendez-vous à ses partisans au Café de Foix. Et c'est là où Camille Desmoulins fait cette fameuse déclaration. Il prend une feuille d'un arbre du Palais Royal et il a dit « Nous devrions porter, comme je fais moi-même, une cocarde à notre chapeau pour nous reconnaître. » Et c'est effectivement là que, du coup, le Café de Foix devient le café des, entre guillemets, cocardiers, ceux qu'on appellera les révolutionnaires.
The revolutionary tradition of cafes lives on in the ideals and passionate intensity of new generations, as does the tradition of cafes as the setting for great love affairs.
When I was a student and I just entered and got out immediately because I couldn't afford to buy a cup of coffee here because we're very poor. But I did have a glimpse of Sartre and Beauvoir because I came up here and I saw them at separate tables and I was very impressed. And then, well, with time, of course, I was a student, I did get into cafes because everybody was sitting in cafes. The cafe, as an institution, is like a living theater. You go to a cafe to look, to be looked at, to pick up a woman or a man according to what you want. It belongs to this kind of tradition. To go to the loo, to buy some cigarettes if you smoke, if you still smoke, and just to be surrounded by people. Really, in this very close society of ours and everything, you can start a conversation in a cafe. And perhaps even to establish a kind of relationship after talking, but you can do it. I mean, it's not rude to talk to somebody whom you meet, and eventually that can develop into a love story.
Although there are many who claim to have opened the first coffee house in Europe, it is actually a Jewish immigrant from Lebanon who deserves the honor for opening the Angel in, of all places, England. Nowhere else does the coffee house have the effect of a liquid torrent pouring over the country.
It was the British, oddly enough, because we think of them as being tea drinkers primarily, but they became the big coffee drinkers. By 1700, there were 2,000 coffee houses in London alone, and every single coffee house had its specialty. The writers would go to one, the bankers would go to another one, and the seafarers would go to another one. It was this ferment of intellect. They were called penny universities because for a penny you could get a cup of coffee and you could have these fantastic conversations.
Of course, people were curious to know what was happening, and they would go to these coffee establishments. And indeed, people wanted to get away from the pubs because you could actually go into a coffee house, and without alcohol, you could actually work through your what you were doing, your business, and so the coffee houses became the kingpin on which the social and the commercial life of London, the City of London, revolved. We're here now in the heart of the City of London. Castle Court, it's no more than 1, 2, 3, it's less than 4 feet wide. All of a sudden it's oozing atmosphere and almost being carried back 300 years. And now the Holy of Holies, this is the corner site of the Jamaica Coffee House. This is the site where Pascal Rosé started his first London coffee business in 1652. Pascal Rosé was set up in business by his boss, who had these trading connections with Turkey. He brought the coffee back, was making it in his home, and he had so many guests, so many people loved this aroma of coffee, roasted ground coffee. So he set up his servant, saying, well, you better start a trend in the city. And so this is where he did it. Behind me is the Royal Exchange, which was established in the 16th century. And around here, once the coffee bars had been opened in 1652, the traders thought they'd found somewhere else to go, to get away from things. And here we are at Change Alley, the most important little thoroughfare for the coffee houses in the whole of the City of London. And it was here that Jonathan's established his business so that the stockbrokers could come over from the Royal Exchange and have their coffees here in the morning, do their business and relax, no doubt, over lunch and have a nice time in the afternoons.
London coffee houses spawn many of the city's important businesses and customs. The Tatler, which becomes one of the early magazines, begins as a broadsheet with reports on the gossip and more enlightened debates overheard in the coffee houses. The tradition of tipping is said to have originated in the coffee house, where patrons tossed money in a bowl labeled "to ensure promptness," or tip for short. Edward Lloyd's insurance business starts out as a coffee house on Lombard Street, catering to seafarers and merchants.
The story goes that Lloyd's of London, as the insurance company, was established because this is where the ship's captains used to come with reports of when they'd arrived in port and with what cargoes. And so it became a place where the information about shipping cargoes was largely exchanged so that insurance contracts could be made.
Lloyd's Insurance, when they moved up from the Royal Exchange area, came here and they built this lovely facade, which was this opening for the new Lloyd's building. And then in more recent years, they built this enormous modern structure behind me, which is today the Lloyd's of London.
London's social and commercial life has always been a man's world. In the past, women were not even allowed inside coffee houses, unless they worked there. As in Paris, the women of 17th century London associate coffee with sex. But unlike the women of Paris, British ladies, excluded from the coffee houses, have a very different idea of the relationship.
There was an idea that coffee was bad for sex. It made men very weak when it came to sex, etc. So that all these funny ideas came and they were interpreted and misinterpreted wherever they went. So that by the time that coffee arrived in England, and you must remember England was a very wealthy place at the time, there was an idea around that coffee really was bad for sexual activity. And we can see that in the very first pamphlets put out by the ladies of London in a thing called the Maiden's Complaint.
Which, among other things, said, when they come home, our gallants have nothing moist but their noses, nothing stiff but their joints, and nothing standing but their ears. So it was very funny. The men wrote a response to this, by the way, where they said that that wasn't true, that coffee, in fact, added a spiritual essency to the sperm and made them much better lovers.
In actual fact, the coffee houses were full of prostitutes upstairs, and the reason for the Maiden's Complaint was that the husbands were slipping upstairs with Catherine for a sixpenny special, coming downstairs for a cup of coffee, and when they arrived home and the wife said, "How about it?" they would say, "I'm sorry, I just had a cup of coffee." And so that's where the problem started. And of course it continued in a folkloric manner from mother to daughter, mother to daughter. This is what coffee does to you, etc.
The women never did get into the coffee houses. What eventually happened was that the coffee houses became private men's clubs, and there were public tea rooms beginning in the early 1700s where women and children could go. And so tea took over from coffee for a variety of reasons.
There was this taste for tea, and of course people would talk about the latest fashion for tea.
Tea becomes not only more sociable and democratic, it is cheaper and simpler to make. And the British, not known for their culinary skills in any case, never really learned to make a good cup of coffee.
Coffee was also much more difficult to make. You had to roast the coffee grounds, you then had to grind or pulverize the coffee grounds in some way, and then you had to make it. Now, coffee making isn't therefore an easy thing to make, but the coffeehouse proprietors said, look, just a minute, this tea leaf, you don't have to roast it. It's already there. All we've got to do is put it in the pot, add the water, and hey presto, we've got a drink which is absolutely marvelous. And suddenly tea became very, very popular. The women liked tea. You had this introduction of the afternoon tea, and the charm and the courtesy and the culture of tea was a very nice, enjoyable experience. And it was the one time of the day when the women knew that they could talk to their children, so it was a family thing. And the imports of tea rose dramatically. And then there was profit to be made in tea.
There was the British East India Company, which had a monopoly on tea from China, and that they wanted to sell that. So by the end of the 1700s, England had become primarily a tea-drinking country.
And so tea became well and truly established. We forgot all about coffee.
Until recently, the average Englishman would drink the same amount of coffee in a year that the average Italian drinks in only 2 days. For the rest of the time, it's time for tea.
What a pleasure it is to make tea, and what a pleasure it is to drink it. Nectar.
As the British trade in tea grows, so does the continent's taste for coffee. In 1700, Europeans are consuming 500,000 pounds of coffee. 100 years later, their consumption has grown to 100 million. And the French are eager to expand their trade. The opportunity comes when a young French lieutenant charms a royal mistress.
Initially, Lieutenant de Clieu was able to get hold of one coffee plant from the French hothouse, which was owned by the king, by seducing one of the king's mistresses, and she gave him the coffee plant.
Gabriel Mathieu de Clieu brings the single coffee plant on a voyage across the Atlantic, nursing it with tenderness and care. He shares half his water ration with the seedling during a drought and protects it from jealous passengers and other threats.
There was an evil Dutchman aboard who ripped off one of the leaves of his plant because he didn't want him, the Frenchman, to bring the plant over. There were pirates who attacked the ship, and he had to protect his coffee plant against the pirates. There was a big storm. But finally, he brings his coffee plant over. He plants it in Martinique. It thrives, and from that single plant, most of the coffee that's now grown in the entirety of Latin America probably descends from that one plant.
But just as the desire for coffee stimulates the age of reason and democracy, it also imposes colonialism in the Americas. The French, like other European nations, established large slave-run plantations to cultivate the precious bean.
After de Clieu brought the coffee tree to Martinique, it spread, particularly in French-owned islands, and one of them was named San Domingo, which is now Haiti. By 1790, half of the world's coffee was grown on this one island. It's really quite remarkable, but under appalling conditions by slaves who had been imported from Africa. In 1791, they revolted. The first thing they did was to destroy all the sugar and the coffee plantations. And as a result of this, Haiti has been the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere.
The slave struggle lasts for 12 years. In a vain attempt to regain Haiti, Napoleon deploys his troops. But they cannot suppress the uprising. It is the largest successful slave revolt in history. When Napoleon learns of his troops' defeat, he exclaims in fury, "Damn colonies, damn coffee."
It's ironic that the reason the slaves revolted in 1791 was that 2 years before, the French Revolution had begun, And in large part, the French Revolution had been planned in coffee houses, and coffee had been one of the germs for it, getting people to think and plot the revolt. So coffee, at the same time, was revolutionizing Europe, but also the slaves were revolting against the way they were being forced to grow it.
Wherever coffee has been introduced, it has brought revolution or change. Coffee, which has given so much pleasure to Europe, will bring enormous pain to Africa, where it comes from, and the colonies, where it's going. The irresistible bean is about to catch fire across the ocean, and it will transform the economies, ecologies, and politics of all the Americas. This is the epic story of a beverage that shares its birthplace with our earliest human ancestors. In this hour, we see how the mass marketing of cheap coffee impacts those who drink it and grow it, and why for millions of men, women, and children, the golden bean has always made a wicked brew. For over a century, coffee prices have been spiraling upward and downward in wild cycles of boom and bust. This has created extravagant wealth for some and needless misery for many. At the outset of the 21st century, a lack of international regulations has left the world awash in more coffee than we can consume, pushing the price of green beans to the lowest level ever. One of the countries most affected is the world's coffee giant, Brazil.
Since the coffee market was deregulated in the early 90s, many changes have occurred in the industry in Brazil. There was a period of great difficulty for Brazilian markets because we would have very low prices like we are having now. Brazilian farmers fought harder to adapt, to produce in a more competitive way, reducing their costs.
Coffee production has gone industrial in Brazil, with cheap beans grown in huge volume. Specialists like George Howell are trying to boost prices by finding a better quality Brazilian coffee, which will command a higher price from the roasters. The search is on at the Cup of Excellence.
Cup of Excellence grew out of a project that I had been hired for by the United Nations to help producers make a higher quality product and then to sell it for higher prices.
Number one, 90 and up. Yeah, baby.
The idea here is to develop relationships between consumers and producers. The producer gets the full result by getting the full price of the internet auction, which really gets extraordinary prices for these lots.
Tastes like turtles, the peanut caramel turtles, you know? I got that over and over.
The experts become more serious as they get close to making their pick. One of this year's finalists is on the verge of losing his farm because of the low market price. Coffee is worth its weight in gold, at least for the winning beans in the winning cup. The Cup of Excellence benefits consumers who have come to take for granted a good cup of coffee at a reasonable price. But if the crisis continues, they will taste the difference, as low prices force producers to cut corners or abandon their farms. And while corporate roasters buying coffee benefit from low prices, the people dependent on growing coffee suffer the pain. Over 2 centuries earlier, coffee hasn't arrived yet in the British colonies. In 1773, tea and ale are the beverages of choice. Ironically, the story of coffee begins when the British put a tax on tea.
The colonists didn't much like the idea of this tax, and they decided to show their displeasure. A local business person and brewer, Samuel Adams, got a whole bunch of Sons of Liberty together. They boarded a British merchantman, dumped all the tea in Boston Harbor. It was a signal that the days of being colonies under Britain were ended, and the signal of which side you were on in the struggle was the difference between walking into a tavern and ordering coffee or walking into the coffee house and ordering tea.
One of the Sons of Liberty is an avid tea drinker and future president, John Adams. He writes to his wife about kicking his tea habit. Tea must be universally renounced, and I must be weaned. The sooner, the better. From this time on, it becomes a patriotic duty to avoid tea. And since coffee is being cultivated nearer to home, it's also cheaper and more accessible. Coffee's illicit entry into Brazil begins as a border dispute and ends as an affair of romantic espionage.
French and Dutch Guiana were arguing over their border, and they couldn't get along about it. So they asked an official from Brazil, sort of an outsider, to come up and adjudicate, and his name was Francisco Paleta. He fell in love with the wife of the governor of French Guiana, and they began to have a passionate affair in between negotiations. And when he left, she gave him a bouquet of flowers, and as a token of her esteem, she put some fertile coffee berries in the middle of the bouquet. So he took those back to Brazil, and that's how coffee got to Brazil. And again, this was a major thing because no one was allowed to export the fertile beans. And then Brazil, of course, became the powerhouse of world coffee, which it remains to this day.
Você não consegue contar a história do Brasil sem contar a história do café. No início da colonização brasileira, você teve vários ciclos, o ciclo do pau-brasil, o ciclo da cana-do-açúcar, mas nada foi tão sólido como a cafeicultura no Brasil. O café determinou o povo brasileiro.
Do ponto de vista econômico, essa acumulação, então, vai permitir, vai exigir, vai permitir, vai incentivar todo um processo de melhoria de infraestrutura, de modernização, ferrovias, portos, sistema bancário, estrutura urbana.
Coffee creates modern Brazil, but at an enormous environmental cost.
Brazil had been a beautiful, self-sustaining place, lovely rainforests, very fecund land, no problem growing everything you needed. But then they began to cut down all the rainforests. They would burn them.
Se nós pensarmos que do que nós tínhamos, me parece que da Mata Atlântica, hoje em São Paulo, do que resta de massa nativa em São Paulo, hoje nós teríamos apenas 10%, por volta de 10%, se não me engano. E se nós olhássemos o mapa de São Paulo, sabendo que o café vai dominar toda a região.
Brazil's agricultural methods have routinely emphasized quantity over quality. When the land is depleted, planters simply abandon their farms and clear new swaths of forest. If the environmental cost is great, the human cost is even more devastating. As Americans grow fond of coffee, plantation owners bring in slaves by the shipful to do the intensive work of coffee cultivation.
Os escravos eles eram amontoados ali nos porões do navio como animais. E ali eles faziam as suas necessidades, tá? Eles tinham uma ração diária por dia, que muitas das vezes se resumia em fubá molhado para comer. E as condições desumanas pioravam mais ainda quando eles chegavam aqui no Brasil. Que já teve uma época que meu pai me disse que um escravo valia o preço de 16 bois.
A manutenção do escravismo XIX, sem dúvida, vai permitir. Quanto mais o café ganhava espaço comercial, mais se fazia necessário trazer escravos.
Até nas próprias cantigas, nos próprios lamentos, que já vem de muitos anos, se fala muito nisso. O café vermelho da cor do sangue do negro e preto pela cor do negro que deu toda essa riqueza para o seu patrão, né?
By 1816, there are over 1.5 million slaves in Brazil, a third of the population. More than half are working on coffee plantations.
O trabalho dos escravos, eles acordavam quando o dia estava amanhecendo ainda, trabalhavam o dia inteiro e só voltavam mesmo para a senzala e só quando estava anoitecendo, né? Era horas a fio de trabalho, com direito a comer uma vez só e trabalhava, o trabalho era muito pesado, muito pesado.
Forma a relação, digamos, senhorial, esses homens que se enriquecem com o café, dessas elites de que eu falei, que se enriquecem no café no século XIX. E no período imperial vão estar obtendo do imperador títulos de nobiliarquia, né? São chamados barões do café.
The plantation owners developed these gigantic fazendas with baronial houses, servants. They developed an incredibly privileged lifestyle, where they also felt privileged that they could go ahead and have sex with any of the slaves that they wanted, and if anybody objected, they could kill them. They were their own sort of mini government, and they were the dictator.
E havia sistema de controle bastante rígido, como se pode ver ainda pelo que restam de senzalas, de aparelhos de tortura nesse período.
Os barões do café, eles só tinham um olhar numa direção, era a mão de obra do negro de graça, que não precisava pagar nada. O preço, a qualquer preço eles queriam se enriquecer. Então, para eles não existia mais nada a não ser a riqueza, a não ser o dinheiro do café, né, que era o ouro da época, o café. Então, para eles, o que interessava era isso, o resto era o resto.
Their pockets brimming with golden beans, the coffee barons hold on to their slaves as long as they can, making Brazil the last nation in the Americas to abolish slavery. But they keep their grip on the market for coffee, which is quickly becoming a staple of American life.
Green grass for my pony, a fire burning dry, and a pot of fresh coffee just to cheer the long night.
In most of North America during the early 19th century, everybody roasted their own beans, which sounds nice, and in a way it was. At least it was fresh roasted. But mostly what people would do would be to put the beans in their frying pan and then sort of stir them around on top of a wood stove. And they would get burned on the outside, they would be raw on the inside, and it would be pretty terrible coffee. And then they would grind them with a little hand grinder, and they would brew it by boiling it for like a half an hour or just leaving it on the stove all day long. Particularly cowboys prided themselves on their really strong coffee, you know, strong enough to float a horseshoe is their phrase. You know, you really want good, strong coffee. And because they put the grounds right in there, they wanted something to clarify the coffee, to make the grounds go to the bottom. And so they would put either dried fish skin in, which does that job, or they would throw in eggshells, which also will make the grounds go to the bottom. So it's fairly disgusting stuff.
For workers of the Industrial Revolution, a cup of coffee isn't about taste, but about keeping alert in the new steam-powered factories. With Brazil producing lots of cheap coffee, Americans can afford to drink it. All they need is someone to roast the beans.
Before the Civil War, nobody had invented a really good industrial roaster, so they had the huge furnace, and it was sort of like a scene from Dante's Inferno. It was hot and smelly and awful and difficult. Finally, a guy named Jabez Burns invented a self-emptying roaster, a very clever device where it had a little screw inside, and all you did was open the front, and it would dump the beans out. And that revolutionized the coffee business.
The second thing that happened was a fellow in Brooklyn, New York, invented the paper bag. It was what we now call a craft paper bag. Those little brown bags, and he had them printed with the face of an elephant on the front for selling peanuts.
John Arbuckle was a brilliant marketer, and he decided to buy a Jabez Burns roaster, roast the coffee beans, and he would put these in these little paper bags and sell them pre-roasted, and he became a millionaire.
Arbuckle's became known as the coffee that won the West. They set up depots to supply the wagon trains. Wherever the settlers went, coffee went with them. Sometimes in a pre-roasted form. Arbuckle's Ariosa was the first national brand of roasted coffee in a package, but others came.
Gold! Gold from the American River! Gold!
The gold rush attracts people from all over North America looking to make their fortune. One is a young man named Jim Folger, who comes from a famous whaling family.
The Folgers were so famous that Herman Melville mentioned them when he wrote Moby Dick. They lived in Nantucket, but by the 1840s, the sperm whales were pretty much hunted out. So the young Folger boys, teenagers, were allowed by their parents to take ship to the boomtown of San Francisco to try to find gold.
When they got to California, there wasn't enough money for all three of them to go up into the mining areas, and so James stayed behind, and he was eventually hired as a carpenter for a Mr. William Bovee, who was going to start a coffee and spice mill in San Francisco.
Glory would it be to taste real coffee again. Maybe an egg or two.
If you had a fresh egg to sell on the trail, you could get $10 for an egg. What do you figure you could get for a pound of coffee?
At that time, most of the people in the gold fields were men, and they didn't have all of the equipment necessary to actually roast the coffee and grind it with them. And so James Folger realized that if they could roast the coffee and grind the coffee and take it up to the gold fields already roasted and ground, it would be better for the miners. And they immediately fell in love with this product.
And Folger eventually took over the entire business and decided that he could make his fortune not from gold, but from coffee.
In the late 1800s, Folger isn't the only businessman seeking his fortune in coffee. As per capita consumption reaches 10 pounds a year, branded coffee proliferates, and the roasting dynasties begin to take shape.
Joel Cheek was a great coffee merchant. His firm, Cheek Neal Coffee Company in Nashville, was just a wonderful, wonderful roaster. And he served the great Nashville hotel, the Maxwell House. The President of the United States visited that hotel and tried the coffee and looked at it, drank it down, turned the cup upside down and said, "Bully, it's good to the last drop." It made his fortune.
Another very famous coffee brand that started in the Boston area was two men named Caleb Chase and James Sanborn. And they began to put out Chase and Sanborn coffee. And again, they were brilliant advertisers. They sold a Mocha Java brand. The fact that it had very little coffee that came from Java or Mocha didn't make any difference to anybody back then. And the fact that they had to pre-stale the coffee before they sealed it into something or it would have blown up didn't seem to make any difference to anybody, and they did very well.
With the family business prospering, James Sanborn takes his daughter Helen on a coffee tour of Guatemala. She keeps a diary about the conditions she sees. We have never seen a dirty Indian, and seldom a ragged one. The women sorting the coffee cherries work very fast, but they are paid only 6 cents a day. The people regard them as little better than animals, addressing them as chucho, a word used to call a dog. The way coffee is grown determines the social structure of many Latin American countries, setting patterns maintained to this day. In Guatemala, like Brazil, coffee cultivation leads to the rapid growth of plantations owned by the wealthy elite. And the government, run by these coffee barons, assures a steady supply of Indian workers.
The meaning of coffee to the Indians 100 years ago was just a way of forcing them to work. When coffee came up here in the 1830s, 1840s, Guatemala suddenly had an export crop. It suddenly had something they could make money on, which for, 400 years they had not had.
Originally, this was just jungle, and when coffee was first introduced to this area, the farms were really hacked out of the jungle. My grandfather, Bernardo Hanstein, came from Germany in 1892. He found himself a lovely German lady who was my grandmother, and they then made their living on the south coast near the Mexican border on a coffee farm. People were brought down from the highlands with the owners of new lands that were being opened up, and they stayed.
The Guatemalan government instituted forced labor in order to make sure that they got the work done, because the population had no desire to go work on farms. The Indians did not get developed this way, but the society was able to become more part of a European cosmopolitan world by virtue of producing enough income from coffee. Coffee has a history of being produced in societies that has been very oppressive. It was part of an entire world of commodity production so that an American could drink a cup of coffee fairly cheaply because the labor here was so cheap. The question is a much bigger one than just why did coffee produce poverty by its production? And the problem, since the colonies have broken up, is these independent countries are gradually trying to pull themselves out of this inheritance of cheap production for the industrial world.
Coffee-producing nations, still struggling to free themselves of their colonial legacy, are soon at the mercy of a new master, the wildly gyrating market.
In 1880, that was the beginning of what's now called the boom-bust cycle. There would be too much coffee, the price would go down, people would then beware and stop growing so much, the price would go up, and then it would start all over again. Well, by 1900, the Brazilians were growing way, way too much coffee. And the price was so low that there was going to be a revolt.
Brazil adopts a radical strategy, withholding part of the coffee harvest in hopes of boosting the world price. But the plan backfires. Because profits are guaranteed, farmers rush to produce even more. Before long, Brazil is buried in unsold beans.
Because there was too much coffee, and because the market was artificially elevated in 1929, the coffee market crashed just a few weeks before the stock market crash. In fact, that was one of the causes of the stock market crash. And then we entered this prolonged Great Depression.
Panic set in on the floor of the stock exchanges as the slump in prices wiped out the savings of countless Americans.
The Great Depression quickly spreads. In Brazil, plunging coffee prices topple the government, and coffee elites install a new strongman. But unlike other Latin American dictators, Getulio Vargas rules with moderation. Faced with ruinous prices, he orders a drastic solution: burn the coffee.
Just around the corner, there's a rainbow in the sky. So let's have another cup of coffee, and let's have another piece of pie.
Vargas fails to raise the price of coffee. And in the US, times are tough too. Consumers can still get a cup for a nickel. But during the Depression, small roasters are no match for big business. Most of the old labels are taken over, and fresh roasts give way to stale, inferior blends in a can.
Everywhere above the Mason-Dixon line, canned coffee became, or cans became, the way that coffee was sold in the grocery stores. Along the way, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Company began to invent what we now call the supermarket. And the supermarket gave you a delivery system. And it was extremely expensive to do this, so only the largest brands could succeed. And slowly but surely, the remnant of the little mom-and-pop store that roasted coffee and sold coffee out of sacks and barrels disappeared.
Even the oldest family-run businesses, like Folgers, are being absorbed in corporate buyouts.
I can remember on Saturday mornings, I was probably 10 or 11 years old, I got to work with Dad, because we worked, of course, on a 5.5-day week, and I'd go down Saturday mornings with him, and I got to load cans onto a belt from the back end of the truck. The Kansas City branch of the Folger Coffee Company was a family affair. My grandfather first, then Dad, when he passed on, Dad took over as head of the company then. My Uncle Joe and my Uncle Frank were all in the business. Dad had retired. He didn't feel there was anybody really ready to take over that big a management jump. We got Procter & Gamble stock in exchange for Folger stock, and they took the control. So we feel we merged into their operation. Sounds better than a sale. I don't drink Folgers anymore, although I'm sure the gourmet would be fine. To get fresh coffee that I like, I'm roasting my own coffee, buying green coffee that I know from experience is good, and roasting my own, grinding it, and roasting it every other day, so I always have fresh coffee. Good to have fresh coffee to wake up with.
Yes.
Boston bean, soybean, how have you been? String bean, I'm not keen for a bean unless it is the cherry coffee bean. I love coffee, I love tea, I love the jabba jive and it loves me. Coffee and tea and the jive and me. A cup, a cup, a cup, a cup, a cup.
During World War II, because it was very difficult to brew coffee while you were in a trench, instant coffee became quite popular.
We wanted to get something to the troops in the trenches in Europe where it was cold and it was dank and it was horrible living conditions that would both keep them alert and help them keep warm.
The military depends upon it because military actions have to go on around the clock and lives depend on them, people being alert and sharp. The best agent they found to produce alertness and improve performance is caffeine.
Tea's all right in its place, I guess. But in the Navy, you will learn to make and enjoy a good cup of coffee. We call it Joe. It'll be your friend throughout many a cold watch, and it's also a way to say welcome aboard to your shipmate.
Draw one, waiter, waiter, percolator, I love coffee, I love tea.
During World War II, the United States was willing to take part in some kind of coffee control scheme because they were afraid that Latin America was going to go Nazi.
In 1940, Brazilians found that the collapse of the European coffee markets had almost wrecked an industry which had been in distress since 1930. U.S. diplomats realized with alarm that if Brazil's economy were allowed to break down, the friendly government of Getulio Vargas might not long survive. To meet the crisis, the U.S. government underwrote the entire unshipped balance of Brazil's coffee crop for 1941, 42, and 43. Time marches on.
After the war, the coffee corporations bring instant coffee out of the trenches and into the kitchens.
The amazing coffee discovery. You know,
Any resemblance to real coffee is purely coincidental. But instant refined crystals made from cheap brewed coffee go well with the post-war rage for everything modern.
The instant coffee that they were making, that Maxwell House and Nestle was making, it was such bad quality that it didn't matter whether you used good beans or not. They would be ruined in the process, so why pay money for good beans?
Maxwell House Coffee Sale. Save money and enjoy the coffee.
The big roasters got into these price wars with each other. And they would cheapen the blend to offer the cheapest possible canned coffee in the store. They would put more and more of the Robusta beans, the cheaper beans, into the blend. And as a result, what was happening was people were drinking less and less coffee. They were literally drinking less cups, but in the cups, they were making more and more dilute coffee because it tasted so bad.
While Americans are drinking worse and worse blends, Canadians are dunking their donuts in a finer brew. Hockey great Tim Horton stick handles his way from pucks to donuts, and good coffee to wash them down.
The early marriage of the coffee and donut was an important one. Canadians' love of donuts. We're the biggest donut consuming nation per capita in the world. Two loves of Canadians, good coffee and a good donut at the same time under one roof. Tim Hortons is a quintessential Canadian coffee story, and the Canadian response has been pretty dramatic.
In Quebec, a new French immigrant is missing the fine coffee back home. Pawning his wife's diamond earrings, Albert Louis Van Hout buys a Jabez Burns roaster and begins roasting beans in the back of his gourmet store.
Well, I was very young, but still I could remember I was going to the store on Ontario Street there, and I remember that it was smelling different, you see, from the street. When you get in the store, it was really a good perfume of coffee. My father wanted to have very good coffee, the bon mélange. It's an art to make a good coffee. If you think you can put coffee in the roaster, and no, you have to follow the processes of doing a good coffee. Otherwise, you cannot make a good coffee.
What Americans are buying isn't good coffee, but a mass-marketed commodity, a hot brown liquid to recharge the batteries. Rather than improving quality, the big roasters try to sell more through advertising.
It's ironic that one of the most famous and one of the most really lilting and wonderful television ads for coffee is the Maxwell House percolator theme, and it's celebrating a pretty bad way to make coffee because the percolators, especially in the 50s when this ad came out, would, recirculate the coffee and get it more and more bitter. But, everybody knows this theme. I think it goes bum bum bum bum bum bum bum bum bum. And, it's a very happy little thing.
Pour a cup of this good-smelling coffee. It will taste as good as it's...
Folgers is the proud owner of the best and longest-lasting advertising campaign in the United States.
Honey, your coffee's miserable.
Honey, you won't be able to give your coffee away.
Ned, really? I just can't make good coffee.
Mrs. Olson would help solve that problem by helping explain how mountain-grown Folgers would be a much better product and help satisfy everybody drinking it.
Ever try Folgers? Folgers coffee? Yeah. Is there some trick to it?
Folgers is mountain grown.
Mountain grown?
That's the richest kind.
When Mrs. Olson first came out, we all kind of laughed because she always wore an apron, and none of us wore aprons, even though that was kind of the housewifely thing to do.
Right. Hey, what happened to your coffee, sweetheart?
Sweetheart?
This coffee's great.
Now that's what I call coffee.
Coffee is only getting better in TV land, while on the streets, consumers continue to drink less. Corporate roasters now attempt to get them to drink more by introducing new products, like Sanka, coffee sans caffeine. Without caffeine, consumers can drink as much bad coffee as they please.
Okay, Cookie, what are you peddling now? Hey, a broken duck. Yeah, well, get it out of here. Thanks, Sergeant. Could I have some coffee? Oh.
You have to know yourself when you're using any drug, any substance.
This is my last warning, Sergeant. Tell your men to stop harassing my client.
You take too much, you're going to feel funny.
So you relax with that pot of ground Sanka coffee.
Where'd you find him?
At the zoo, swimming with the seals.
You got anything to say for yourself?
Okay.
It gets you through the day.
For many, it's still regular coffee that gets them through the night. In their local 24-hour diner, over their bottomless 10-cent cup.
I'm feeling mighty lonesome, haven't slept a wink.
But in the mid-50s, the days of the 10-cent cup are numbered.
In between I drink black coffee.
When Brazil is hit by bad weather, a scarcity of coffee pushes the market price up for the first time in decades.
Everybody's always looking at the weather in Brazil to see, is there going to be a drought or is there going to be a freeze? Those are the two things everybody elsewhere in the world prays for, and some people in Brazil pray for, because it boosts the price of coffee. So in 1950 and in 1954, that happened. The price spiked very quickly.
Monday, August 27th, 1956, coffee increased another 3 cents a pound wholesale. I don't know how much it went up retail, but it probably went up. Among them were Chase and Sanborn, Manning's, Maxwell House, MJB, I mentioned then Folgers, were expected to follow suit. In most cases, the increase in the price of green coffee from South America has given the reason for the hike. Well, that's true, it had gone up.
I can't think that if the price of corn went up substantially that we would have congressional hearings. But that's because corn is grown in the United States. But when the price of coffee spikes, we have congressional hearings. This happened in 1950, 1954, 1977. At the 1950 hearings, a guy named Andres Uribe from Colombia testified before Congress, and it's a remarkable speech that he gave, and it's still true today, where he basically said, look, when you're talking about coffee, you're not just talking about a simple commodity. You're talking about the lives of millions of people.
Uribe continues his testimony. We in Latin America have a task before us which is staggering. Illiteracy to be eliminated, disease to be wiped out, a sound program of nutrition to be worked out for millions of people. If we could secure a fair price, we could work a miracle. If not, then you cast these millions to drift in a sea of poverty.
It's the coffee that goes with happy times. The richest coffee flavor known is Folgers flavor. Folgers flavor.
No one pays much attention to Uribe. Consumers know little about the problems of producers in the South, and the big roasters have no trouble ignoring the situation.
Mountain grown.
Caught up in Cold War paranoia, Americans dismiss the speech as one more example of communist subversion. Bus fares can go up without fanfare, but coffee is another matter. At the urging of the roasters, U.S. politicians let Latin America know that the way to make more money from their coffee is simply to sell more.
I would walk in the darkness before you came along.
The 50s was a particular time, and countries like Brazil, Colombia, Mexico organized a system of cooperation, and Colombia was one of the leaders, and we opened an office in New York, and they discovered that the coffee consumer didn't know anything about coffee. Where does it come from? How is it grown? Who does it? That's why we created in Colombia the image of Juan Valdez, the name of the typical coffee grower that used to come with his mule and the 2 bags of coffee.
One day in Colombia, South America, Juan Valdez took his coffee to market. He had grown the beans in rich mound soil. He had shaded them so they would ripen slowly. In the market were 2 American coffee buyers. They bought for brands that used only Colombian beans.
6 months after this campaign started, coffee consumption went up. There was a contact, an awareness with the coffee grower.
This pleased Juan.
At that time, a Pan-American Bureau to promote coffee was created with the contribution of the United States and Canada and the coffee-producing countries of the area. The coffee break was originated there.
The Pan American Coffee Bureau launches a media campaign and introduces the term coffee break into the North American vocabulary.
Time up for a coffee break.
Would you like a better cup of coffee for your coffee break?
The coffee break is a deliberate attempt to increase consumption, but the strategy does not reduce the oversupply of coffee. In Brazil, once again, the glut causes prices to collapse amidst cries for President Vargas's impeachment. Vargas responds in an open letter to the nation. After decades of domination by international economic groups, I put myself at the head of a revolution and won. Then came the coffee crisis, and the value of our main product rose. We tried to defend the higher coffee price, but the response was so violent we were forced to give in. I have nothing more to give you now, except my blood. Putting down his pen, Brazil's longtime dictator shoots himself through the heart. Vargas's suicide undermines the already fragile social order in Latin America, leading to a period of Cold War instability.
A communist-influenced government ruled Guatemala from 1945 until this summer, when exiled Guatemalans came back with guns. This was revolution. The anti-communist rebels invaded from neighboring Honduras.
In Guatemala, President Jacobo Arbenz's land reforms are affecting the privileges of the coffee elite and foreign enterprises. Fearing a communist takeover, the CIA sponsors an invasion. It's a disaster for the country. The new president annuls the reforms, and years of oppression and bloodshed follow.
2,000 miles away, the United Nations met in extraordinary Sunday session. Russian delegate Serapkin got Lodge's blunt warning.
Representative of the Soviet Union, stay out of this hemisphere. And don't try to start your plans and your conspiracies over here.
Despite the U.S. warning, Cold War tensions only escalate. From the coffee fields of Latin America to the rice paddies of Southeast Asia, the U.S. engages in an anti-communist campaign culminating in the Vietnam War. Faced with a threatening adversary, the U.S. is prepared to make a new alliance.
In 1962, finally, the United States entered what was known as the International Coffee Agreement. They weren't afraid of Nazis anymore, but they were afraid of communists. They felt that if the price of coffee went too low, there would be revolution all throughout Latin America. So they were willing to enter this sort of OPEC agreement for coffee called the ICA, the International Coffee Agreement.
The coffee agreement was the result of a political agreement adopted at the highest level to create better trade conditions for the commodities that were produced by more than 50 or 60 developing countries around the world. And there were different approaches. For coffee, it was the quota system.
Under the quota system, producing countries agree to limit the amount of coffee they export, and consuming countries agree to limit what they import. Despite constant battles over quotas, the system works. Coffee growers enjoy the longest period of relative stability they have ever known. But like most price control schemes, the agreement is subject to political and economic pressures.
Nobody was ever very happy with this agreement. It involved all the consuming countries, well, except Russia never joined it. And it involved all of the producing countries, all of whom were jealous of each other. There was a constant fight as to what the quota should be. In 1989, the whole thing fell apart. Brazil wanted to back out of it for various reasons. The U.S. wanted to back out of it because the Cold War was ending. Cold War was over. The Berlin Wall had just fallen. There was all this coffee in reserve, and everybody rushed to dump it onto the world market before the price went too low. And of course, what that did was to drive the price ever lower. So the bottom dropped out of the market for years, below the cost of production.
The world's coffee giant is not about to take the low prices lying down. To Brazil's coffee industry, this means war.
Eu termino sempre com a frase do general de guerra chinês Sun Tzu, que dizia que na paz, prepare-se para a guerra, e na guerra, prepare-se para a paz. E eu termino dando um enfoque, o que isso representa dentro do mercado de uma commodity como o café. O produtor, durante os preços baixos, ele tem que se preparar para os preços altos. E durante os preços altos, ele tem que se preparar para os preços baixos. Que esses ciclos são inevitáveis.
Brazil prepares for the next bust in the cycle with a huge investment in farming technology. Massive new machines replace human labor, so producers make a profit even when prices drop fairly low.
A Ipanema preocupa com a mecanização do café. A Ipanema tem 11 milhões de pés de café e a produção para o ano que vem está estimada em 125 mil sacas. Mais de 50% do seu café mecanicamente, implementando quando elas são de bom aproveito para a empresa.
A partir daí, novas tecnologias, ela veio para viabilizar grandes empresas investindo no plantio de café. Agora, em termos de qualidade, o produtor brasileiro ainda deixa a desejar.
As the quality of Brazil's industrial crop is dropping, the multinational corporations are getting their coffee cheap. They are the winners when Brazil's production hits a record 50 million bags. But the real corporate windfall comes when a war-weary, tea-drinking nation bursts onto the coffee market. In just a decade, Vietnam's production swells by over 1,000%.
Vietnam became the second largest coffee producing country in the world. And the coffee they're producing is primarily Robusta, which is a low quality coffee in the first place, but it's also, they're producing bad Robusta. Well, what's happened is they've flooded the world with bad coffee, and that's the real reason for this coffee crisis. Now, Brazil is also growing way too much Robusta. It's not just Vietnam. But there's no question that this is all tied in together. You say the word Vietnam to a coffee grower in Guatemala, and they will, make the sign of the cross and spit at you because, they blame the Vietnamese for the current coffee crisis and for the fact that they can't make a living.
After a century of boom and bust, the world's worst commodity downturn becomes a full-blown global crisis. The effects are nowhere greater than in the coffee-growing regions of Central America. Here, entire communities are dislocated, and families have little access to the basic necessities of life.
Pues lo que es la crisis de café es una pobreza que existe entre la familia, entre ambos, pues esposo y hijos, porque sabemos que de la crisis del café sufren los niños, lo de que es la salud, lo que es el vestuario y el estudio.
Nosotros los pobres de Guatemala ya no podemos conseguir trabajo porque del café vivíamos. Porque no hay trabajo aquí, tenemos que emigrar. Unos al departamento, otros a la capital, otros intentando a Estados Unidos, donde lamentablemente algunos logran sus objetivos y otros encuentran la muerte.
Él es Jesús López Ramos, él es originario del estado de Jalisco y el estado de...
The crisis captures the world's attention when 14 Mexican coffee farmers, searching for a way to feed their families, die crossing the Arizona desert.
Para mí, mi hermano mayor era lo máximo, porque siempre se enfermaba mi papá y mi mamá y siempre corría yo con él por ser el mayor.
At the turn of the 21st century, many of the people who produce our coffee are only marginally better off than their enslaved ancestors. The wild cycles that led to the latest crisis will certainly continue until governments and the big coffee corporations help end the chaos in the coffee market. Even at the best of times, it would cost most coffee farmers a full day's wages to buy the frothy cappuccino consumers enjoy daily in their local coffee house. But ironically, it is this new generation of coffee lovers who could be Latin America's best hope. The dissidents who emerge from the Vietnam War develop a taste for good coffee and a growing consciousness of the world around them. They begin to ask not only for a better cup of coffee, but where their coffee is coming from and at what human price.
E preto pela cor do negro que deu toda essa riqueza para o seu patrão, né?
It's just this little seed and has this enormous political, social, and economic impact on human beings.
This is the epic story of a beverage that shares its birthplace with our earliest human ancestors. In this hour, we see how our growing awareness of what goes into a good cup of coffee prepares the way for the specialty industry, which may be the harbinger of a just and sustainable future.
I walked into a Starbucks about a year ago. A little kid behind the counter.
Hi, sir.
Yeah, give me a regular. Regular what? Coffee. What flavor? Coffee flavored.
Grande non-fat latte, one equal and with cream.
Got a grande mocha Valencia.
I have an iced grande caramel macchiato.
You can get every other flavor except coffee flavored coffee.
Latte.
They got mochaccino, they got chocochino, frappuccino, cappuccino, rappuccino, al pacino. What the
At the Specialty Coffee Association's annual meeting, members reach out to bridge the divide between northern roasters and southern growers.
The joy of the SCAA show is that you find people from all around the world. So here's a scene I've read about, the very best way of making coffee. Your individual vacuum press coffee. Oh God, it's got the most pure fragrance.
Can I buy this equipment?
Oh, cash?
I remember talking to investors and they say, you want to charge $2, $3 for a cup of coffee with Italian names that no one could pronounce at a time in America when coffee consumption is down. That's exactly what I'm going to do.
You should get that espresso first with that hint of lemon, followed by...
Baristas are the bartenders of specialty coffee. At the World Barista Championships, they compete to concoct the latest gourmet coffee cocktail.
And enjoy.
Tomamos café. Y todo el mundo que toma una taza de café lo toma como por placer, pero no sabe que detrás de una taza de café hay mucha gente trabajando. Detrás de una taza de café hay un problema social.
Well, what you can see behind me is a train of traditional donkeys, very much of the kind that in a country like Ethiopia would deliver coffee to market. And we're bringing those donkeys here to the Stock Exchange in London to deliver our message to some of the world's most powerful companies. We're saying to them it's time to ensure a decent price for the farmers who produce the coffee that we drink.
Reaction against big corporate coffee sparks the specialty coffee revolution. A revolution that tries to do the right thing, while at the same time drinking fully from the cup of life.
It really began with people who just wanted good coffee. All they wanted was a decent cup of coffee instead of the swill they were being given. But it did lead most of them to realize that in order to get good coffee, you actually had to go down and see how it was being grown, and you had to give people a better life while you were doing it. You had to pay them to make better coffee. And this spawned a whole group of fanatical, devoted followers.
The whole 60s was an opening up to the world. We frankly had nothing but contempt for what came before us. It was a complete, total rejection of the coffee industry.
New Maxwell House Western Blend gives you honest coffee pot flavor every time.
You tasted this infernal coffee, and once you had tasted the good stuff, it was like two different worlds. And many years later, in '68, the whole specialty scene is born with Peet's, and this was almost like a religion.
Peet's in Berkeley and Murchie's in Vancouver roast quality beans in their small shops. When three hippies with gourmet taste try the coffee, they're inspired to set out on a quest for the perfect cup.
We had bought Peet's by mail from the Bay Area, had driven to Vancouver to buy coffee there. There were a few shops in New York. There was a little bit of the beginnings, or if you like, the end of the last specialty coffee business that provided the seeds for the next generation of specialty coffee.
In 1971, Jerry Baldwin and his partners open a little coffee bean shop in Seattle's Pike's Place Market and name it after the coffee-drinking first mate in Moby Dick, Starbucks.
It was instantly successful, and I became the person who was the roaster and the coffee buyer as we started to develop our own independence from Alfred Peet. And it just got in my blood.
Thank you very much.
Quality coffee is getting into a lot of people's blood, and the counterculture coffee house scene is about to be marketed to the world.
Now since the brewing and the pressing of the caffeinated coffee bean, some pretty heavy hitters have been hitting at the coffee house scene, like Albert Einstein and Edward Lloyd, Ginsberg, Picasso, and Freud. It's just a partial cast of friends from past who held the cafe in high esteem. And today the coffee house beats out of sight when the players get together for a hoot on a Monday night. You may see them walking in, oh, they got those whiskers on their chin, and talking that bohemian rag. Even at Starbucks, all it revolution, it's clearly evolution, and talking that bohemian rag.
I joined Starbucks in 1982 when we were opening our 4th store, believe it or not. The epiphany for me, though, was when I was actually sent by Starbucks to Italy and became enamored with the Italian coffee bar. The romance of the Italians and how they brought coffee to life, the theatrical presentation, the extension of people's homes. And I realized that despite the fact that Starbucks had done this wonderful job in educating people in Seattle about coffee, in a way they had missed what I thought was the most significant opportunity, and that was the romance of the beverage and creating a sense of community in the store. And since Starbucks only sold whole bean or ground coffee for the home, I raced back from Italy with this wonder in my eye about recreating the Italian coffee bar in my own image and bringing it to America.
Back in America, Howard Schultz buys out Starbucks and opens 3 cafes a week in his own image. Jerry Baldwin chooses to stick with roasting and acquires Peet's. While in Canada, an unlikely coffee mogul is swigging cheap wine and living on the streets.
In the early 70s, I'd hit a very difficult point in my life. I had an addiction to drugs and alcohol, and that had taken me to a place that was really quite alarming. I ended up on Skid Row in Toronto, Jarvis and Shooter Street, panhandling on Yonge Street for nickels and dimes to get a bottle of wine, to get a place to stay, 50 cents a night, flop houses.
If we wanted a blanket, we'd throw you another maybe 25 cents or so. And we didn't care about the blanket because we had a bottle of wine.
Sure, a bottle of wine.
We were called winos then. Now we're called street people.
Is that right? Yeah, well, I used to be a wino with you.
Yeah.
99 cents for a bottle of wine, remember that? It was a time in my life where I experienced things that no person really needs to experience. And however it happened, in late December 1971, there was a kind of a moment of truth, a moment where I saw myself perhaps as I hadn't before, and I realized I couldn't go any further. I couldn't do this anymore. I started a company called The Second Cup. Do you know it?
Oh, I know the coffee cup.
Yeah, I created
Well,
it.
yeah.
So that's why they're doing it.
But you know something? 7-Eleven got better coffee than Coffee Time.
Well, Coffee Time, yeah, but Second Cup is much better.
I know it's better. Yeah, it costs more though.
Costs more, exactly. Good meeting you.
I'm a pleasure meeting you.
Good luck.
Adios. Thank you. God bless you all.
In 1974, I met a guy named Tom Culligan, and he and I were determined to win in spite of all odds, and we decided to go into business for ourselves. I'll never forget it, the first time we ordered coffee. We looked in the yellow pages, where else would you look, and we found a supplier of coffee, and we phoned him, and we ordered this coffee. We had labels, he had that coffee, so he sent it along, and in those days it used to come in brown paper sacks, lined, and they would stamp the outside of the bag with Columbia, Mocha Java, Kenya, and we'd put each one in the appropriate bin. We hired a woman that came into the store, and she knew something about coffee, thank God. And she looked at all these beans. She said, oh, they're the same bean. The guy just changed the stamp, you know. You want mocha? I have mocha stamp. And one day we were commiserating, wondering what we were going to do about business, and we went into a Baskin-Robbins store. What changed The Second Cup happened right there and then. When we came out of the store, Tom saw how I sampled the ice cream. Why don't we brew a little bit of coffee and sample the coffee? And then the final idea that really changed everything is we decided we would charge more money for our coffee than anybody else in the mall so people would know they had a good cup of coffee. Well, the lineup started at our kiosk and never went away.
Daily draws, daily winners, and Second Cup is first on hand.
Charging the highest price in the mall means selling a quality bean, which is what brings specialty roasters to La Minita, one of the finest coffee estates anywhere. Here, The Second Cup and Pete's are more than willing to pay a premium price. Today, Jerry Baldwin arrives with his staff from San Francisco.
The trees that you see here are about 1 year old. To get the seed stock to start off the coffee trees here in the nursery, what we do is we go around the farm and look for trees that we know have yielded very, very good fruit during the harvest. We take some of that fruit, like this one, and we pop the seeds out just like we would do if we were milling the coffee for preparation, and let it dry on the patio to the parchment state. And that parchment coffee then gets placed into one of these plastic pots, which is filled with a mixture of fertilizer and soil from the farm. It takes 2 or 3 years before they start to produce any fruit, and really 5 years until we're into full production.
For most people, the ideal cup of coffee, or the perfect cup of coffee, is produced of washed Arabica coffee. So, perfect conversation for being in Costa Rica, because it's one of the world's best producers of washed Arabica coffee.
Costa Rica specializes in Arabica beans, and consumers seem eager to learn what makes them so different from the lowly Robustas. The coffee tour at Cafe Brit is the country's 3rd largest tourist attraction.
Here in Costa Rica, by law, we only plant Arabica. It has the sweetest taste, better quality bean, less caffeine also.
Is better paid in the market.
That's important. Ya salió, qué rápido salió este, Carlos.
The best Arabica grows up in the mountains. At that altitude, the coffee beans are very hard and heavy. And if the beans are hard, they can resist the temperatures in the roaster oven. The low-ground coffee is porous, is fragile, it will break and it will burn in the oven, and that gives coffee a bitter taste.
You're picking a fruit that's full of sugar, which is, we know, starts fermentation. So this has to be treated quickly and carefully to remove the sugar, dry the coffee, and capture the flavor that's in the bean.
Would you like to taste it?
¿Quiere probar?
Yeah. No, no, no,
Ay,
esa
no,
no.
esa
No, de esa, no, no, no, de esa que
Ay,
tengo.
qué
Me le voy a dar una chupada.
All of the flavor potential exists at the moment of picking. Each step after that provides the opportunity to maintain that flavor or impair it in some way or other.
Bueno, ahora lo que estamos en este momento es en la recolección de café. Que queden bien cogidas, bien juntados y nosotros le damos un tiquete para que vayan al costo. Solo coger la calidad, porque eso es lo que quieren ellos, solo el rojo. Nada de verde ni nada de pintón, solo la calidad, solo el rojo. La cajuela está a 400, ¿verdad? Y hay personas muy rápidas, hay personas que cogen 6, 7 cajuelas, 8 cajuelas. Hay personas que se ganan 5,000, 6,000 colones. Eso depende de cómo sea la persona, el peón.
Costa Rica has a few large plantations and many small farms which traditionally grow quality coffee. But the farmers' share of what consumers pay is far too little to ensure their survival.
I was born in a coffee family, so I grew up with the coffee plants instead of a backyard, but I love it. Here in Costa Rica, we have production costs that are close to 90 cents per pound, and the international price is 60. So we can't afford that. So we had to find out better ways to sell our coffee. And there's programs like Fair Trade that really help the people that is growing coffee in this country and other countries around the world. The idea is to eliminate the middleman, the man who is getting richer because of the bad prices. Give a premium to those farmers who have those difficult conditions to produce coffee to improve their lives.
Hi, have you heard about the Berkeley Coffee Initiative?
The Berkeley what?
Coffee Initiative?
It's in favor of Measure O.
Anybody a Berkeley voter?
Do you vote? Coffee.
Yeah, have you heard? Oh, would you like to? Oh.
Any business in the city of Berkeley that sells coffee has to buy coffee from fair trade growers?
It means that all brewed coffee sold within the city has to be organic or fair trade or shade grown.
60s Berkeley was the home of social protest and specialty coffee. Today, a new issue has hit Telegraph Avenue. Instead of free love, it's fair trade, and consumers are being asked to consider how their coffee is grown.
Not too much, but
then aren't you forcing people to do something that they may not want to do, even though it's the right thing to do? I mean,
isn't that the way we do things in society? We don't ask people to drive the speed limit. We don't ask companies to pay minimum wage. We tell them to. We don't ask companies, hey, could you follow these environmental guidelines? We say, these are the laws. This is what you need to do.
But I wonder if everybody knows why they're doing that.
Fair Trade Certified is the symbol seen more and more in shops and cafes around the world. It assures the future of the 500,000 small farm growers in the fair trade movement. This is why groups like Global Exchange are advocating for fair trade in coffee.
Imagine if your only source of income was once a year, and you had no idea month to month what that was going to be, if it was going to be $300 a year, or if it was going to be $500 for the year, for your total yearly income to feed all of your family, put your kids to school, put food on the table, pay for your housing. So what normally happens is that sometime in the fall, a local person referred to as a coyote will come to these farmers and say, hey, I see that your kids don't have any shoes or that your daughter's sick. I tell you what, I will pay you money up front for your harvest now to take care of your immediate needs if you promise me your harvest when it comes in the future. And they get locked into this cycle of poverty and crushing debt because of this. Many of these farmers got together and formed cooperatives, and by working together, gained more power vis-a-vis the market. Then throughout the years, they contacted different organizations in Europe, in the United States, in Japan, and different countries, and set up fair trade systems. And what fair trade is then is an international system for assuring that farmers get paid a fair price for their work.
Few places depend more on fair prices for coffee than Latin America. It is such an important crop that schools break for the coffee harvest. Some children get time off to work beside their families, but the children of migratory workers don't go to school at all. They have to work the year round.
There's no experience like traveling to source. After meeting the people that grow the coffee that I was selling every day, I couldn't just look at it anymore as a bean or as a beverage. It became a symbol for the relationships that I'd developed with people, for their sense of community and for their families and their hopes and dreams for the future. One of my missions has become to educate people about coffee and about the people that produce coffee. So it's a great conversation piece when you're making somebody's latte to say, so by the way, do you know that this latte is a fair trade latte? And do you know what that means? And I was in Nicaragua last summer and I met the man who grows this coffee that you're drinking. That's a really cool thing to be able to say to someone. The perfect latte starts with the perfect espresso shot. Now we begin the espresso extraction. I'm grabbing a chilled container for my steamed milk, because the chilled container helps me make better foam, and some cold whole milk. I love producing the awesome latte that the person comes back and says, that's the best latte I've ever had. You're listening for when the bubbles are coming out like tight, foamy, frothy bubbles. And I can also hear when the milk is hot enough because it gets to a deeper pitch. It's like hearing the right musical note. You've left maybe half an inch in the top for your espresso shot, which is by now done extracting. And you pour it very slowly into the foam, and you'll see that it stays just above the layer of milk, so you get this beautiful sunset effect. And then you can even add a little chocolate sprinkles if you like. It's perfect.
While many might agree on what makes a perfect latte, not everyone agrees that fair trade is the only way to share the wealth. There are a number of alternatives in the specialty industry, including the one being pursued at La Manita.
In the 80s, it was becoming apparent that the coffee market was going to collapse. At the same time, I had recognized this new quality awareness in North America, where people really were becoming concerned about the quality of the product. So I tried to think of a way to take the coffee and disassociate it from the world price, and came up with La Manita. We took it to the small roasters in North America and delivered the coffee ourselves. A lot of those very first people that we sold to are still clients. Second Cup were very determined to sell a really good cup of coffee, and we made an arrangement to sell them an exclusive of La Manita in Canada. I don't think anyone had ever gone directly to the specialty industry and said, here's a coffee that we grew, it's a fixed price. But the premium is based on getting something of value. Specialty coffee itself is innately supportive of people producing coffee because that premium flows all the way down the chain. You're not going to get anyone to produce great coffee unless they're rewarded for it. If he's not worried about his housing, the health care of his family, he's going to do a good job with the coffee. We pay everyone more money in order to do it right. And that reward is innately ennobling. I have a problem with a lot of the fair traders. I believe that it's essentially cultural imperialism. It's all unsustainable. If the charitable side of it dries up, poof, it's all gone. There's virtually no concern with quality, which is the one thing where you can actually add value to a product so that you can sell it for a fair price. We don't sell fair trade coffee, we sell fairly traded coffee.
Ya eso dentro de la finca, para hacer la casa, lo ganamos la plata aquí dentro de la finca. Después de ahí compramos un lotecito por allá donde vivimos, hicimos la casa y lo fuimos para allá. Tengo novia, vive por allá abajo, muy largo, ¿verdad? Y me gustaría casarme y seguir trabajando dentro de la minita, hacer una casita para vivir. Seguir trabajando dentro de la minita, porque aquí fue donde lo superamos nosotros.
Bill McAlpin rules his paradise like an enlightened monarch with an obsessive attention to quality. But his approach doesn't necessarily work for smaller growers without his vision and international business connections.
Soltarlo, dejarlo ir, que vuele, que encuentre su propia voz. Ya no me pertenece a mí, yo se lo dejo a él. Soltarlo al aire, dejar salir del pecho este sentimiento que en mí murió. Yo ya vi mi sol nacer y hoy vuelve a amanecer. Volver a comenzar en la vida, mirando un cielo azul, con fe y con mi poder, con todo el corazón, llevando esta canción por la vida.
Many people in the specialty industry are familiar with the plight of producers and have actually seen the devastating effects on quality of the coffee crisis. And so they want to make sure that in 10 years from now there will be a specialty industry. They are paying a lot more real attention to doing what they need to do to make sure that their industry is sustainable and really leading the way for the rest of the coffee industry so that the cans, as we refer to the Folgers and Maxwell House and those folks, are really put on the defensive.
Yeah, horrid.
It was cheap.
I'm not surprised.
It came in a huge.
How huge?
It'll last a long time.
Last a long time? How long?
Well,
6 weeks?
I think it's very
Yeah.
nice. Now look.
About 2/3 of the entire coffee industry is dominated by just a few players. Folgers, for example, is owned by Procter & Gamble, and they do over 600 million pounds of coffee a year.
You know, the Folgers looks richer.
Maxwell House is the second biggest label, and they're owned by Philip Morris, the global cigarette company. And then we also have Sara Lee.
Be back in a second with coffee.
There's Nestle, obviously, which is a huge company around the world in terms of their coffee holdings. After that is Starbucks, and they are over a $2 billion company, and with their expanse worldwide, they are really the global leader in the specialty coffee industry, and they actually make more money per pound than just about any coffee company in the world.
The major labels buy nearly half the world's beans every year, while Starbucks buys less than 2%. But as the leading specialty company, Starbucks occupies a unique place in the market. as it tries to live up to its claim that coffee is more than just a commodity.
We feel very, very strongly that we have a responsibility as the leader in this industry to lead and to define for the marketplace that the cost of doing business in this industry is to give back and to make an investment in the sustainability of this marketplace.
When protesters in Seattle trash a Starbucks cafe at the World Trade Organization summit, the company has to defend its image as an enlightened multinational corporation.
We are not going to let something like this dissuade us from maintaining dialogue and cooperation with organizations that care about these issues, because we care about them too.
It's ironic that Starbucks sometimes is the target for ill will or concerns because we're such a visible and ubiquitous company. But the truth of the matter is that we are doing such a good job to build sustainability and make sure that the people on the ground doing the work are rewarded for their efforts in ways that are not happening through traditional methods. Unfortunately, the road is paved with so many companies, many of whom are much, much larger than Starbucks, who are doing very little and sometimes nothing at all.
Starbucks likes to compare itself to the big three companies when it comes down to sustainability because obviously, as a company, they are far and away better than Folgers and Maxwell House. I think that that's really not where the competition is for them, though. They are competing with all of the other specialty coffee importers. So their leadership really needs to come in terms of the specialty industry. And what we've seen is that they're a follower and not a leader.
When the World Trade Organization met in the fall of 1999 in Seattle, the home of Starbucks, Starbucks was a perfect target. At that time, they were not selling any fair trade coffee. They were the world's largest supporter of care, and they were doing all kinds of good, but they were perceived as being the sort of big guy, the McDonald's of coffee. So I can understand why activists have done what they've done, and they have moved Starbucks along faster than they would have gone. Now, Starbucks is selling about 1.6% of fair trade coffee. They've been criticized for not selling enough of it, but that's still a huge amount. They're also selling organic coffee, shade-grown coffee that is bird-friendly, and about 15% of their coffee support the growers who will abide by their certification standards, which are quite high.
One day in Colombia, South America, Juan Valdez took his son Ramon to show him how he grows coffee.
Today in the highlands of Colombia, small growers like Juan Valdez face being forced off their land or having to support their families by growing drugs, the cash crop that never goes bust.
Then came the part Ramon liked best. Juan hoisted him on his mule.
Specialty roasters understand the role they play in supporting farmers like Juan Valdez and their families.
When I spoke before Congress, I quoted a Wall Street Journal article. 125 million people's lives are being affected by the low prices of coffee. The load on each farmer's shoulders is getting heavier every single day. When I was in Colombia, I talked to the Jinotega mayor and I said, well, why don't you grow something else? And the mayor said to me, you need a quick cash crop to survive. They gotta feed their kids tomorrow, not in 5 years. They can't say, don't eat for 5 years and then I'll put a meal on your table. So these farmers did a desperate move and they started planting cocoa plants. But then the drug lords started stealing their sons and forcing them to join paramilitary groups. These 55, 60-year-old farmers had tears in their eyes as they talked to me. They told me that they organized a cooperative. It wasn't easy. The drug lords killed some of the farmers that formed the cooperative. But they fought, and eventually people started buying the fair trade coffee. They were able to fight off the drug lords. They were able to make a living off of a quality cup of coffee.
As specialty roasters find better ways to support their sources, many are looking to them as a new economic model for a more equitable relationship between North and South.
Coffee is a path along which 500 million people in the world are journeying. And to bring awareness to that path is my personal mission in life. Here is a way, specialty coffee or very high quality coffee, here is a way to change the face of this industry. Not only in the cup around the world, but at the farm level. These are some of the poorest countries in the world, and to find that bridge and build that bridge so that people could really understand that if coffee is grown in a certain way and the necessary care is given to it, it will support you. Most of the farmers I met hadn't ever tasted their coffee. They had no idea what it tasted like. And they had no idea how it compared to their neighbor or the guy down the road, or certainly had no idea in Guatemala what a Costa Rican tasted like, or a Sumatra or an Ethiopian. I mean, the world of coffee was their own little tiny farm. As I learned their microcosm, I tried to share with them the macrocosm of all the places that I'd been and the different techniques of people around the world that were doing the same thing that they were doing.
Like many small farmers around the globe, Alfredo Rance provides a healthy environment for both the workers and migratory birds on his finca. But until specialty buyers came along, Alfredo wasn't aware that his organic bird-friendly coffee could fetch a premium price.
3 años llevo certificado orgánico. Perfecto. Sí.
¿Y las especies de árboles?
Bueno, hay variedades aquí, tal como este. Porco. Porco, la semilla es para animales. Y también las aves.
Para las aves.
Sí, los dos, el tipo de ave y animalitos también lo comen.
Qué bien, excelente.
With his farm now certified, Alfredo makes 3 times more than he used to for the same beans.
El café no estuviera como está, como ustedes lo ven. No, la hoja de café nos hace follaje, nos produce abono. Nos produce abono.
Sí, correcto,
Sí,
correcto.
como usted puede observar, don Francisco, al producir esto, la mata se alimenta de esto.
Correcto.
Y nos produce el fruto muy, muy completo.
Fertilizante natural.
Perfecto. Nosotros los agricultores en café orgánico ha sido primeramente que nos han enseñado a trabajar con la tierra sin echarle ningún químico. Más luego, la salud de nosotros ha mejorado constantemente porque no produce ninguna intoxicación.
Correcto.
Sí.
Al no aplicar químicos.
Al no aplicar químicos. Y más luego, pues estamos disfrutando también de un precio que la empresa nos favorece mucho.
The coffee plant was born in the understory of the African rainforest, so it's a shade-tolerant plant. It's like a house plant. It likes to be in the shade. In the 1970s, agronomists learned that you could cut the forest off of a coffee farm and expose the plant to the full sun, bathe them in agrochemicals, and double or triple the production. This is a full sun farm, and this is not the kind of farm that the Rainforest Alliance would normally certify. But there's an important thing happening here. This farm, Finca Aquiares, is reforesting. You can see a few trees coming in already. They're planting thousands of trees every year. It might take 20 years before this is a forested farm. We want to show that coffee can go back towards sustainability. There are millions of bags more coffee than we consumers are willing to drink. And what the world wants is more quality coffee. The farmers can grow less coffee, get a higher price for it, consumers are happy, wildlife is happy, workers are happy, so it's one of those rare win-win situations.
For a person who wants to buy coffee that will do good for the world, there are a number of options. Certainly fair trade is an obvious one, and it's a good one. Rainforest Alliance also has a certification which does good for the environment and for the people who are growing the coffee. If you buy specialty coffee in general, you're probably supporting decent practices in the coffee places where it came from. But it's a very small part of the world market. Consumers of the 21st century are by and large far more aware of the fact that when they buy something at a supermarket, they're having an effect in the world. They're making a statement by what they buy. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the time they still say, well, what's cheaper? I'm going to buy the cheapest thing.
While growers are trying to survive, the big bucks are being made only after the beans are unloaded in the north. This is most true of Starbucks, which is trying to accomplish what many consider the impossible: to straddle the divide between long-term sustainability and the short-term profits needed to build a global brand.
Today there are way over 6,000 stores. We are now the most frequented retailer in the world, where the average customer is coming in 18 times a month. And in terms of the growth and development, we will open between 3 and 4 new stores every day in 60 countries.
The company that popularized caramel macchiato is today in the early stages of its global conquest. And wherever it raises its flag, Starbucks gives locals a taste of America, which is what goes into every cup.
Neden yanlış yapıldığını da gösteren 3. bölüm. Evet, 80'le giden
Trainees arrive in Seattle from afar, including young Turks who come from the country that introduced coffee to the West.
Dediğim gibi
Now they are being indoctrinated in the Starbucks way.
sistemini kullanıyoruz.
Can someone tell me what a perfect shot is?
It comes in 10 seconds.
Any comments to that?
Yeah, 18 seconds.
Excellent.
Wow. I feel like I'm drinking Turkish coffee. That coffee as we call kahve, they're very old. Still in Istanbul, in the big metropolitan city Istanbul, you can find in the back streets. Usually the man goes, they drink Turkish coffee. But Starbucks atmosphere will be different than those cafes because everybody can come to our Starbucks.
At Starbucks, the coffee house is no longer an exclusive male domain. Women have a place here too. For every franchise, no matter how far-flung, is an outpost of the contemporary world.
Yes, we will gonna use some English, Starbucks language, tall, grande, and frappuccinos. In the beginning, it will be difficult for our customers, but we're gonna teach them how you order the coffee, how you can enjoy our coffee.
It has been an unbelievable turn of events over the last 6 or 7 years to watch the response that people all over the world have had to Starbucks. And that experience is not American. That experience has a universal language and universal appeal, and that has been the big breakthrough for us.
Starbucks is about making universal a standardized coffeehouse culture, which is at best its appeal, and at worst, the threat it poses to other cultures in its path.
A lot of people don't like Starbucks because it's exactly the same experience wherever you go. You can count on Starbucks being clean. You can have bright baristas asking if you want a grande size, etc. And Frankly, I think that's justified criticism in many cases. I mean, if you don't want exactly the same Starbucks experience, go somewhere else. The good news is that usually there is an alternative.
One alternative to corporate sameness is Delocator.net, the California-based website created by Extine to sustain independent cafes and local culture. Simply type in your zip code and find every alternative cafe within a few miles of your door.
Go ahead, we can hear you.
Corporations like Starbucks that are international and that have a lot of power and money have a much larger advantage in marketing and taking up our space in culture, and as a result end up dominating largely how our culture perceives reality. So the philosophy is that there are ways to combat that. There are ways to provide alternatives to that kind of, and there are ways with the internet to gather as a community, let other voices. That the target for anyone who's looking for an alternative.
Starbucks has bought out some very good chains, and they will continue to do that. They are the big bully on the specialty block. There's no question about that. They're very good at what they do, and they're going to keep doing it.
You have two of the greatest noses in the entire country right here. These are people that we
How much is your nose insured for, John?
And his nose is featured on my Pete's frequent drinker card. I mean, it's so important that this is what you see, Jim's nose. George is looking for individual traits that he thinks could indicate a great single coffee. That's his passion. Whereas Jim, his blends are a legend. He's like a symphonic conductor.
In a world where the rich are getting richer and the poor poorer, there will always be a future in catering to the refined tastes of the true connoisseur. For those seeking the perfect cup today, there is no contest as to which is the finest coffee. It's Ethiopia's Yirgacheffe.
This is a very subjective thing. So one person's favorite doesn't mean it's the best, even if it's George. But the thing is that we all did, as a consensus, we did agree that number one had the qualities that made it an excellent cup of coffee.
Like that perfect peach that
It's very round.
explodes. Exactly. It's got that roundness, but all the acidity is there too. But it's perfectly cradled by everything else and the flavors in it. And to me, that's worth anything you can pay for it.
Wow, I think we're in danger of a real bifurcation in the market again, because all these people are still purveying really good quality. And I think many more people are aware of it now, but the baseline of quality that is found in supermarket cans might well get lower.
I agree with Corby. We're going back towards the commodification of coffee. You've got 3 years now of prices that are so low that the majority of farmers, even in good locations producing good quality, are getting way below the cost of production. The availability of quality coffees is going to diminish.
I don't think that we have to worry because there is now a coffee consumer developing an understanding about the second largest traded commodity in the world after oil. Nobody says, well, my oil smells good, or my gas has this wonderful essence or aroma. We are dealing with a product that we are trying to liken, to provide a crossover, a heritage to the tradition of wine.
That's last year's $4.97.
The debate here is not about quality of coffee, but about whether our growing appreciation is sufficient to conserve the supply of quality beans. Will there be enough people who regard coffee as a fine wine or the ingredient of a gourmet meal?
Je pense qu'il y a des points communs entre le vin et le café. Souvent on dit que le café est un excitant, mais le vin est un excitant aussi. Un jour, on a même osé faire une crème de coquille Saint-Jacques, une charlotte de crabe comme ici, etc. On s'est aperçu qu'en associant un café chaud, on est arrivé à des accords tout à fait étonnants. L'idée n'était pas de dire on va éliminer le vin, on va servir que du café. Non, pas du tout. C'était surtout d'anoblir le café et vraiment de lui redonner une place, non pas à la fin du repas, mais dans le repas et sur la table. C'était l'objectif. À l'origine, le café s'appelle le vin d'Arabie. Le vin d'Arabie se déguste dans un verre. Les Arabes boivent le café dans un verre. Donc, sans s'en apercevoir, on n'avait pas inventé quelque chose, mais on était en train de lui donner une dimension différente. Monsieur Café, vous êtes à votre place, à l'honneur sur la table.
Coffee lovers alone cannot bear the burden of bringing about a just relationship between producer and consumer. Activists worldwide are appealing to big government and the Big Four to follow the sustainable path taken by the specialty revolution.
When people open their morning newspaper tomorrow, hopefully then they're drinking their morning coffee, they'll have a bit of a think about it. This is about the whole world coffee market not working. And so we're really looking for them to support the Oxfam campaign, to take Nestle and Kraft, and we can get the powerful governments to actually take action to alleviate some of the suffering.
Excuse me, you've got that fuel.
One of the recent campaigns we've been working on is to pressure the leading U.S. Retailers of coffee to adopt fair trade standards. It's going to be a much harder campaign. They're not nearly as susceptible to consumer pressure as Starbucks was, and they buy the worst quality coffee in the market. Unfortunately, consumers are contributing to the problem because we don't know about the situation, and so we keep buying coffee from these terrible coffee companies. Nobody gets up in the morning and says to themselves, I'm going to go get a cup of coffee and I want to make sure that I'm exploiting farmers and polluting the environment. Nobody says that. Yet unwittingly, we are contributing towards massive environmental devastation and exploitation in terms of taking food off the table of farmers when we buy coffee that's not sustainable. And it's really our choice.
As this ancient bean finally reaches the northern consumers who can delight in the pleasure of their coffee, the hope is that the quality of the bean, the quality of the environment in which it grows, and the quality of life of the farmer who grows it may all just come together in the perfect cup.
Going to Ethiopia, we started out across the savannah. And there were lots of people walking. There was hut after hut, round huts. I noticed that there weren't pit toilets. There weren't wells. I had little girls come up to me and hold my hand. And they pulled me into the hut of their mother. And when I looked at that woman, I knew the love she had for her girl, her daughter. I knew she wanted for her daughter what I wanted for the daughter you met. She brewed coffee out of very dirty water that she had hauled up from a stream 4 hours away. She boiled it over a little stove in a coffee pot. It had coffee that she'd pestle and mortared. What she was serving me in that cup was the world's finest coffee. she was serving me Yerga Chefi.
Yerga Chefi, in the birthplace of coffee, is one of the finest coffee-growing regions in the world. Here, farmers have started the first Ethiopian fair trade cooperative. They hope that by forming this cooperative, they can provide the basic needs for their families, keep their culture and their community together, and realize the dream of a better future for their children.
Senekala luwo, Senekala luwo, Senekala luwo, Senekala luwo. Aniche, anibara, Aniche, anibara, Aniche, anibara, Aniche, anibara. Senekala